Welcome back to a new video. I hope you enjoy it. The Old Man in the Mirror. When Jessica moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, she was thrilled. It was her first place on her own, a charming, if slightly worn home that seemed to have a personality all its own. The floors creaked in the right way, the walls had a history, and the intricate woodwork was a marvel from a bygone era. There was just one quirk she hadn't noticed during her initial visits: the large, ornate mirror in the upstairs hallway. The mirror was old, framed in dark, heavy wood, with carvings of twisted vines and grotesque faces etched into the corners. It hung at the end of the hallway, directly opposite her bedroom door. There was something off about the mirror, something that made her uncomfortable every time she passed by. It was almost as if the mirror was watching her. At first, Jessica tried to ignore it. The mirror was probably worth something, and besides, it was too heavy to move on her own. But as the days went by, the sense of unease grew. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision or the feeling of being watched when she was alone. But then, one night, everything changed. Jessica was brushing her teeth in the bathroom when she thought she heard something behind her, a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. She glanced up at the bathroom mirror but saw nothing unusual. Shaking off the feeling, she turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. As she walked toward her bedroom, she passed the mirror and froze. For a split second, she saw him, a gaunt elderly man with hollow eyes and skin stretched tight over his bones. He stood in the reflection, not in the hallway behind her, but within the mirror itself, staring directly at her. Jessica whipped around, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but there was no one there. Heart pounding, she turned back to the mirror, but the man was gone. She laughed nervously, convincing herself that it had been a trick of the light, her imagination playing tricks on her. But the image of the old man haunted her dreams that night, his hollow eyes burning into her mind. The next day, she tried to put the incident out of her head, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that mirror. When she passed by it during the day, she felt the same prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as if she were being watched, but she refused to look into it, afraid of what she might see. That night, Jessica lay in bed, unable to sleep. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wood. She tried to close her eyes, but every time she did, she saw the old man's face, his eyes hollow and unblinking. Suddenly she heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Jessica's heart raced as she strained to listen, the sound unmistakable in the quiet of the night. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, growing closer to her bedroom. She sat up in bed, her eyes fixed on the crack of light beneath her door. The footsteps stopped just outside her door, and she held her breath, waiting, terrified of what might come next. For what felt like hours, there was nothing, just silence. But then from the hallway she heard a faint, raspy whisper, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Look at me." Jessica's blood ran cold. The voice was coming from the mirror. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but the whisper came again, louder this time, insistent. "Look at me." The voice sent a shiver down her spine, freezing her in place. She knew she should get up, open the door and confront whatever was out there, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear. The whisper came again, almost a growl now, dripping with malice. "Look at me." Unable to resist, Jessica slowly got out of bed and walked to her bedroom door. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She opened the door a crack and peered out into the hallway. It was empty, but the mirror at the end of the hallway was different. The old man was there again, standing in the reflection, his bony hand pressed against the glass. His eyes locked onto hers, and his lips moved as he whispered one final time. "Look at me." Jessica couldn't look away. She stepped out into the hallway, her feet moving as if they were not her own, drawn toward the mirror by some unseen force. The closer she got, the more clearly she could see him, his hollow eyes, his sunken cheeks, his skeletal hand reaching out to her. She stopped inches from the mirror, her breath fogging up the glass. The old man's mouth twisted into a smile, revealing yellowed teeth sharp and pointed. His eyes burned with a sickly light, full of hunger, full of malice. And then, before she could react, his hand shot out of the mirror, cold and clammy, gripping her wrist with a strength that belied his frail appearance. Jessica screamed, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron tight. She watched in horror as the man began to pull her toward the mirror. The surface of the glass rippled like water, and she felt herself being drawn in, her reflection distorting as the mirror swallowed her whole. She struggled, digging her heels into the floor, but it was no use. The old man's grin widened as he pulled her closer, his laughter a harsh, grating sound that filled her ears. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was his face, inches from hers, his eyes glowing with a malevolent glee. The next morning, when the landlord came by to check on the house, he found the hallway empty. The mirror was there, as it always had been, its surface smooth and undisturbed. But Jessica was gone, vanished without a trace. The landlord frowned, puzzled but not overly concerned. The old Victorian had a way of losing tenants, people who came and went, leaving without notice, their belongings left behind, as if they had simply disappeared. He didn't question it anymore. He glanced at the mirror, noticing something strange. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure in the reflection, a young woman with wide, terrified eyes, her hands pressed against the glass, as if she were trapped inside. But when he looked again, there was nothing there. The landlord shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination, and walked away. As he closed the door behind him, the mirror in the hallway stood silent and still, its surface dark and empty. But if you looked closely, deep within the glass, you might just see the faint outline of a figure, watching, waiting. And every so often, when the house was quiet, you could hear a whisper, soft and distant, like the rustling of old leaves. "Look at me." The silent self. I used to work late nights at a call center, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights flickered just a bit too often. One night I was alone in the break room, sipping stale coffee and scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd. A message popped up on my screen from an unknown number. "Look up." I chuckled, thinking it was one of my co-workers playing a prank. But when I looked up, the room was empty, just me and the humming vending machine. The message was unsettling, but I brushed it off. As the night dragged on, more messages came. "Don't turn around. Do you see it too?" Each message sent a shiver down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just a sick joke. That was until I got the next one. "I'm in the reflection." My blood ran cold. I was sitting in front of a blank computer screen, the kind that acts like a mirror in the dim light. Slowly, I forced myself to look at the screen, heart pounding. At first, it was just me. Then behind me, a shadow began to form. It was a dark, shapeless figure with glowing eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it raise a hand, mirroring mine. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. Then it waved. The final message came through. "Switch places?" And before I could react, the power went out. The room was plunged into total darkness. When the lights flickered back on, I was staring at the screen again. My reflection was normal, but something was different. I wasn't in the break room anymore. I was in a place that looked just like it, but wrong. The colors were muted, the sounds distorted. My phone buzzed again. "Thank you." Now I'm stuck here, watching that thing live my life on the other side. It smiles at me sometimes from the reflection, a twisted version of my own face. I don't know how long I can stay sane in this place, but I do know one thing. It's waiting for someone else to take my spot. So, if you ever get a strange message late at night, don't look up, or you might just end up here too. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.